Hi science friends. In yesterday's video I told you that today we were going to talk about inheritance patterns that are beyond just simple dominant and recessive. So everything that we have talked about up to this point, organisms can show one of two traits. They either have the dominant trait if they're homozygous dominant or heterozygous, or they have the recessive trait if they are homozygous recessive. But we know that in everything that's not the case, right? Like that works for some things, like either you can roll your tongue or you can't. Either you have albinism or you don't. Either you taste PTC or you can't. Those either or traits that are coded for by one gene, which is one spot on the DNA, those are going to be simple. Many of them are going to be simple and dominant and recessive traits, but not everything is going to be quite that simple. So remember, in our DNA molecule, DNA is a big molecule, and there are lots of genes on the DNA molecule. Okay? And so this gene would code for one thing. Another gene would code for another thing. Another gene would code for another thing. And then sometimes also multiple genes can code for the same thing. And that's what we're talking about here, and that's what we'll get to later today. Multiple genes can sometimes code for the same thing. And so that's what we're going to talk about as we move forward. So we're going to introduce, I think, 4 different patterns of inheritance today. So the first one is incomplete dominance. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say that I do not like the way that they have done this Punnett square. So I'm going to fix it right here just a little bit. It really should use all the same letter, R, not R and W. Okay? So, in incomplete dominance, one allele is not completely dominant over another. All right? What we talked about yesterday and the days before were complete dominance. If you crossed a red flower and a white flower, if red was dominant, you would get red flowers if they were heterozygous. Okay? In this case, in incomplete dominance, red doesn't overtake white. Instead, what you get is a pink flower because red is not dominant to white. They are incompletely dominant. They come together and you get what's called an intermediate phenotype. Here it says in incomplete dominance, the heterozygous phenotype is somewhere in between the two homozygous phenotypes. So I like to call it an intermediate phenotype. Okay? Those big R, little r's are going to be intermediate. Big R is still going to be red. Little r is still going to be white. Okay? Now, the reason that I took away the W, that I said I didn't like the way that this diagram was shown, is because using the same letter, big R and little r, indicates that it's showing the same trait. Okay? If you do something like a W, that kind of indicates that it's a different trait. Now, some people prefer to do that because you can use a different letter and you can make it capital, and so then it doesn't look like one is really dominant or recessive. But I think the best way and the most correct way is to keep with using one letter where, it doesn't matter. If you would have called red little r, that would have been okay. Okay? As long as you know that intermediate one, that pink one, is the big R, little r. Okay? So that is incomplete dominance. Another one that is somewhat similar to incomplete dominance is codominant. So in codominant, instead of seeing a blending of traits, you see both phenotypes expressed together. So if you had a big R plant that was red, and you crossed it with a little r plant that was white, all of your offspring would have big R, little r, and they would show this phenotype that is both seen there. You can have something that's pink and white, or red and white both. I'm going to call this red instead of pink. Okay? Have something that's red and white both. You could have something that was striped, that was spotted. But the point is, you see both phenotypes. They don't blend together as they did in incomplete dominance. Okay? Now, I always use this example. This is not really a true example, so don't go telling people this is like a true example. But let's say, for example, you took a black cow and you mated it with a white cow. If that inheritance pattern was incomplete dominance, you would see a blend. What would your cow look like? You should say it would be gray. Okay? You see an intermediate phenotype. If it were codominance, then you see both of those expressed. You see a black and white spotted cow. Okay? The dairy cows that we know to be. All right? Now, that's not exactly how dairy cows are formed, but I always like to use that as an example. A third inheritance pattern is multiple alleles. Okay? So, in everything that we have seen so far, there's only been 2 alleles. You could get a big A or you could get a little a. But some traits, for example, blood type, there are more than 2 alleles. Okay? Now, each person, this is important, an individual cannot have more than 2 alleles. But what has more than 2 alleles is the population. Okay? So, for example, blood type. There's 4 blood types. There's A, there's B, there's AB, and there's O. And we're going to study blood type in depth, and I'm going to help you type your own blood in about a week or so. Okay? So hang tight for that. But we're just going to preview it just a little bit here today, talking about multiple alleles. And also, it's true for blood type is also codominant, and we'll talk about that, how that occurs as well. So, blood type, you can have 3 alleles, IA, IB, or little I. Okay? Now, any person only has 2 of those alleles. Okay? I'm blood type A. So that means that either I am I big A, or I am I big A, little I. I don't know exactly which one of those I am, but I'm one of them. Okay? One of them. Somebody, though, is going to have a blood type B. Okay, that's another possible blood type. I just don't. You only have 2, but there's 3 in the population. Okay, there could be more than 3 in the population for a different gene. But for the blood typing gene, there are 3. Okay? We'll also get into positives and negatives, AB positive, AB negative, A positive, O negative, those kinds of things later when we talk about blood type. So that'll be fun to do in person. All right. Now, a third one, or also on the same thing with multiple alleles, is hair color. Okay? If hair color were simple dominance, as in what we talked about yesterday and the days before, you would either have like brown hair or blonde hair. But we know that that's not really the case, right? You have a lot of variation in hair color. You can go from really dark brown, almost black, to, very, very light blonde. Okay? And that's because hair is coded for by multiple alleles. And when you get all those different variations in, then you get lots of different combinations. Okay? When we have 2 alleles, big A and little a, you can only be dominant or recessive. When we have 3 alleles, you can have A blood type, B blood type, AB blood type, and O blood type. Okay? But if you had 10 alleles, then you could have many, many more combinations. And so that's why we see so much different variety in hair color. Okay. Also, sun and environment can impact that as well, and we'll address that more later on. Okay. So, the fourth inheritance pattern that I want to talk about today is polygenic traits. And so, let's break this word down. Polygenic. What do those terms mean? Biology has a lot of terminology, so it's important that we try to work with these root words, okay? So genic probably sounds like a gene, right? And poly means many. So polygenic traits are going to be traits that are controlled by many genes. Here we're saying specifically 2 or more genes. Skin color is an example of that, okay? Skin color, like I drew in a diagram earlier, there are many genes on your chromosome, and skin color is controlled by many of them. If it were controlled on one gene, then you would have fewer variations. But since it's controlled in many genes, then you have more variations. And so skin color is a polygenic trait. It's controlled at more than one place in the DNA. Okay? So, wrapping up what we know about Mendel. Mendel studied plants, but we know his principles apply to humans too. Okay? He was in the 1800s doing most of his studies. But after him was a guy named Thomas Hunt Morgan, and we're going to talk about Thomas Hunt Morgan more next week, that studied genetics and studied sex-linked traits. He studied fruit flies. I hate fruit flies. You all have probably seen fruit flies. You know, they're more common in the summer. They swarm around your bananas and those kind of things. But they were a good organism for his studies for a lot of different reasons. Number one, they're small and easy to maintain. Nobody cares if you kill a fruit fly. They reproduce really quickly and have lots of babies. They have small numbers of chromosomes and not that many genes to manipulate. So they were a great organism for studying fruit flies. And so Mendel started with pea plants. Thomas Hunt Morgan went on to fruit flies. And then they said, you know what, this is going to apply to humans too. And we know now today that of course it does. And then lastly, just as I mentioned with hair color, the environment also plays a big role in that. You know, if you go out in the sun, if you're out in the sun in the summer, your hair does lighten. Maybe if you swim in the pool, sometimes if you're in too much chlorine, if you have blonde hair, maybe your hair can even turn green. So there's the genetics part that you inherit, but there's also an interaction in the environment. We looked at pea plants and their height. Right? They could be tall or they could be short. But if they're not going to get water, even if they're deprived of nutrients and deprived of some of the things that they need, even if their genes say they should be tall, they may be short. Okay? So environment does play a huge role in our traits as well. Okay? So that is all for the lesson. You should have a worksheet that says non-Mendelian inheritance patterns, and that's going to walk through incomplete dominance and codominance and multiple alleles. So if you have any questions about that, then you can let me know. Okay? And if not, then you all have a great day.